Tonight on Diabetes Chat, we welcome Renza. Renza was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 1998. Her work roles are described as a diabetes and health advocate, peer support and social media consultant, health writer, media spokesperson, workshop presenter and facilitator. She has worked for diabetes organisations for over 20 years and currently works at Breakthrough T1D. Renza is also the head of advocacy at #DDoc. Renza often travels around the world speaking at conferences on topics such as peer support, diabetes technology, diabetes stigma and language. In her personal life, Renza is the owner, editor and writer of a blog sharing her journey with type 1 diabetes. She's also contributed to many online and in-print health publications. Tonight we're honoured to welcome Renza, and we will be talking about diabetes stigma, language matters and the DDoc. Welcome, Renza, and a massive thank you for joining us today and giving your time. So welcome, Renza. Today we're going to have a chat about diabetes stigma. So is it okay to ask you a few questions?
Oh, I would love to be talking about diabetes stigma, and it's so great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
No problem. So for people who might not be aware, what is diabetes stigma?
Yeah. So there are all sorts of, official, I guess, explanations and definitions for what diabetes stigma is. But I think, people are also quite confused by it, I think, sometimes. But really, it's the negative perceptions about diabetes, the way that diabetes is spoken about in negative ways that can lead to discrimination, that can be full of bias, that paints diabetes in a really negative light. And what that then does for people living with diabetes is that it makes us feel stigmatized, and that can result, and that can be a really wide range of things. It can make us feel pretty horrible in a healthcare setting. It can make us feel pretty lousy when we're doing our shopping and somebody might say something. It can make us feel really uncomfortable at school or at work or at a sporting club, because there are these perceptions and preconceived ideas that paint diabetes in a really negative light, and people living with diabetes as well in a really negative light.
Yeah, definitely. Have you had any experience of that yourself? How has it made you feel?
Yeah, I think, yes, absolutely. And I mean, we know that, and this is based on a survey that was done a few years ago by the Australian Centre for Behavioural Research in Diabetes. And I know that you've had Jane Spate on your show before, that showed that 4 out of 5 people with diabetes have experienced diabetes stigma. So this isn't something that just a couple of people have experienced. When I say most of us have, that I mean that. And I certainly have as well. I think where I see, where I've had probably the most negative experiences have unfortunately been in healthcare settings. And we know that that certainly is a place where there is often stigma. When we hear things, like, blaming and shaming us for how we're doing or not doing, perhaps, or, not meeting care plans that often we've had absolutely no involvement in developing ourselves. And that's not in any way to take away from the truly remarkable and the vast majority of healthcare professionals who are doing such a sterling and stellar job. But unfortunately, there still are health professionals who enjoy standing up at conferences and calling us non-compliant diabetics and, pointing fingers rather than saying, how is it that we can support and help you more?
Yeah, definitely. And even in recent conferences, I've definitely seen that still. So
Yeah.
I think it's good to talk about it and how it makes us feel.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of mental health, what would you say mental health means to you, and how does stigma impact people with diabetes who may struggle with their mental health?
Yeah. I mean, so again, this is one of those things that, I'm very much speaking from my own personal experience of having lived with diabetes and where, the mental health and emotional health challenges, I guess, that I've experienced. And, there've been periods of extreme diabetes distress and burnout. There have also been, I think that when I think about the day-to-day burden of diabetes and just the impact of living with a health condition every day. In fact, I just today, I had to have an MRI. I've just been diagnosed with arthritis in my hands. I had to have an MRI, and I thought I had done such a great job planning for this. I'd been really careful about thinking about when I was going to need to change my pod and my sensor and time it just right, diabetes maths, time it just right, and make sure I had spares with me to be able to put them back on as soon as I finished with the MRI and everything. And I ended up doing something really silly when I got there, and I just thought, this is just so exhausting. And this is, I think, for me, where the mental health burden of diabetes is the most significant. It's a relentlessness of this condition that, when, even when we're absolutely trying our hardest, there are still curveballs. We forget things, or, something that worked perfectly yesterday doesn't work today, and all of those sorts of things. It just adds that extra degree of difficulty that is exhausting. And, there is decision burnout, there is data burnout, all of these sorts of things, I think, are the issues that really negatively impact my emotional well-being. And also there's some really weird disordered eating stuff that, I've had to work through, because, I feel like there's a lot converging around that. There's, Gen X and growing up with the most horrific diet culture that, oh my goodness, undoing that is impossible. But at the same time, then being diagnosed in my early 20s with diabetes and being told some pretty wacky food things to start with that I don't think helped that relationship that I had with food already. So there's that as well, and working through that. And that feels like, I often think I've got that under control now, and then again, there's something that happens that throws everything into disarray. And that there's always a lot going on with diabetes, and I think that's the bit that really can impact our mental health. And stigma does make it worse. I think that when we're having a really lousy diabetes day and we hear some crappy TV show calling something diabetes on a plate, or talking about people with, like, dehumanizing people with diabetes and the condition that we live with, or making a joke out of it. It sometimes feels like it's just, this insurmountable mountain that we're trying to just, even if we're never going to get to the top, but at least stay upright as we're climbing it, that it's just one more thing that makes it really tough, really difficult.
Yeah, it is hard, and I think just something that people might not think about is it'd be the smallest thing that they'll say, but it'd be that thing that just tips you over the edge into, like, I can't cope, sort of, and how you feel about managing. Yeah, definitely, it is really difficult.
And I think, how resilient and robust we're feeling at any time really impacts on that, right? Because there are some times where people could be slinging so much mud at you, and you're like, water off a duck's back. I'm so robust. I'm so resilient right now. I can just, like, my arm is up. I'm good. I can deal with this. I will slap down anybody who says anything like that. And then another time, it could be something just tiny or something big, but that's it. And you just dissolve, and that's just too much. And that, I think, is the nature of living with a chronic condition, is that there are these ebbs and flows, and there are times where we do feel stronger. There are times where we don't. It could be, depending what else is going on in our life at that moment, other frustrations, perimenopause adds this whole other level of weird, I don't know, like, this is just like next level hormonal craziness that you're trying to manage while you're dealing with everything else. And that question of, is this me? Is this a perimenopause thing? Is this a diabetes thing? Is this just because I'm tired and I haven't slept properly? And is the reason that I didn't sleep properly because I'm perimenopausal? All of that sort of stuff. There's a lot going on. There's very little quiet time in my mind when there's all of these things happening. And I think that makes things pretty tough. And, we don't need stigma on top of that. Like, I always have really felt that stigma is such an unfair burden on top of other burdens as well, because it's so unnecessary. It's just so unnecessary.
Definitely. Yeah. And why is it, like, when you go to, like, the GP for something that's completely, well, I say that's kind of my point, completely unrelated, and it's like, oh, it's because you're diabetic. Is it though?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know that's just such an extraordinarily frustrating thing for so many people. I hear this all the time, you know, people sort of go to see a GP as like, I fell over and I've hurt my knee. Could I have cracked my knee? I was like, well, you could have, but also, you know, how are your blood sugars right now? I'm like, well, right now they're getting higher and higher because I'm getting stressed and more stressed because you're trying to blame me being clumsy and tripping over on my diabetes right now. You know, it's just, yeah. I don't know. I think, I mean, that I've had some really great conversations though with clinicians about that, and you know that story of when you find a really great clinician, you hold on to them. And I found that GP who was so brilliant, and he was just remarkable in that he had a real curiosity about diabetes, and he was always so respectful and saying, can I ask you a question about type 1 diabetes and living with it? And when I started seeing him, it was very many years ago, and he probably hadn't seen too many insulin pumps, and he saw one and he was like, oh my, I've got questions. And but he also understood that my endocrinologist is the one who deals with my diabetes, and so we didn't talk about that. So we had sort of this little routine where he'd say, how's your diabetes? Which is the most annoying question ever. And I once said, and I told him that, I said, it's a really annoying question. Don't ever ask that. So he would always ask it as a bit of a joke. And I'd say, oh, it's still there. And he'd say, yeah, I've just received a letter from your endo. I know how everything's going. What are you here for? And then we could really focus on that. Sadly, I live in Melbourne in Australia. For those of you who are looking at a very big map of a very big country, I'm on the south east coast, and he moved to Darwin, which is really north, and so that was quite rude of him. I had to train up a new GP.
Oh no, I hate it when that happens.
I know, right?
Hate
Yeah,
it. Like,
yeah.
how dare you retire?
Exactly. We
You're
just
not
had this
allowed.
working. Yeah, yeah,
Oh. Do you think like the stigma around diabetes stops people who are living with it from telling people, whether it's at work or
yeah,
at a club that they go to, or and even like asking for support?
yeah. I've heard so many stories of people doing that. You know, I have worked in diabetes organizations now for 24 years. And so I speak with a lot of people with diabetes, and I hear some really incredible stories that, you know, I'd like to think things are better than they were 25 years ago, but I still hear stories of people being told, don't tell anyone, don't say anything. And part of the work that I do, I'm very fortunate in that I get to speak with people from around the world. Stigma is different depending on where you go. Stigma is harmful wherever you are, but stigma is very different the way it plays out and what people's experiences are around the world. And I've spoken with doctors who, you know, in some lower income countries who have heard of people, you know, parents of young kids who have been diagnosed with diabetes who are basically told take your child home to let them die. And you know, I mean, the horrific impact of that being your introduction to diabetes. I don't know how, unless you are then very fortunate enough to wind up finding a community, finding an amazing doctor who can reprogram that thinking, that's a pretty difficult thing to overcome. But I know of so many people who make a decision, you know, it's our decision as to what we disclose, obviously. But if we're making that decision because we're afraid of being stigmatized, we're afraid of being treated differently, we're afraid we might not get promoted, that we might be given, you know, the lousy jobs to do because people think that that's all that we're capable of, that we won't get picked for the footy team or whatever it might be. Yeah, you know, that is a sign that is how stigma impacts. And I hear of people who don't want to tell anyone because they are so worried about that, or they've had such a negative experience. And this is where stigma in healthcare settings can be so harmful. When people have a really negative experience, for some people that means they don't go back until, you know, they really feel like they have to. There might be something that they think, I've really got to get this checked out. And then often, you know, if they find themselves in a situation that was similar to the one beforehand, there's now not only all of that, but they might have, you know, showing up again after there's been a break because they've made, they haven't wanted to go back, they're then blamed for anything that's gone wrong. If you had been coming and seeing me, we could have picked this up earlier. It's so multifaceted and so problematic when people are made to feel made to feel a way that means that they're not able to really seek the care that they want or the support that they want.
How do you think we can kind of help to break those barriers down?
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about stigma a lot more now, which, it's a bit like the language movement, right? So the first language position statement was launched in 2011. And I know this. I know that it was in September 2011. I was there. It was in Australia. It was in Melbourne, Australia. It was at the museum in Melbourne. And I was there. I was involved in the development of that first thing. But I get really annoyed when people say, the Language Matters movement started in Australia. I'm like, no, it didn't. That's a load of rubbish. The first language position statement came out of Australia, absolutely. But the diabetes community had been speaking about this for decades, I remember having conversations and seeing conversations about this online when I was first diagnosed back in 1998, right? So this isn't something that, a diabetes organisation decided was an issue, so brought some researchers on board and said, let's do something about it. And stigma is a bit the same. People with diabetes have been talking about stigma for ages and ages and ages, and about how harmful it is and how it makes us feel and how we really need to be mindful of this issue. And we are now seeing people talking about it. You can't go to a diabetes conference pretty much anywhere in the world without stigma being on the agenda. There is more research, and this is all really, really positive stuff. And I think that, every incremental step is a step in the right direction. There was a global, international consensus statement launched a couple of years ago. That's really important. And so I don't want to in any way say that the position statements or the consensus statements aren't important, because they are, because they often come with evidence and there's research behind it. And that's super, super important when we want clinicians and researchers to sit up and listen and realise that it's not just people with diabetes having a bit of a gripe and a whinge. So these pieces of evidence are super important. But we've got to look at it as this is, as with everything, it's what people with diabetes are saying. And often that's where the solutions are as well, is listening to people. And so there have been some really impressive things happen that have addressed it. We're talking about it. Number one, we've had some really great campaigns about it. Breakthrough T1D UK did that incredible video last year that, has people thinking about type 1 diabetes in a different way. We're talking within our own community about how damaging stigma is, and often how people with type 1, we are the worst when it comes to talking about type 2 diabetes, and this, desire that we feel that we need to distance ourselves from people with type 2 diabetes, which just contributes to the stigma so very much. And having those conversations is really important. And also we need to hold mirrors up and understand how self-stigma impacts us as well. We internalize stigma, and we have to do some work to change what we're thinking, within ourselves to be able to really help ourselves in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. I will come back to that point about the different types.
Yep.
So hold to that thought.
Sure.
What do you think are the most common misconceptions that contribute to stigma? Regardless of type.
Yeah. Yep. Look, I think that I don't think people understand just how complex diabetes is a lot of times. So I think that people think that, I remember, I remember when I was diagnosed and I had this very lovely doctor who just made this sound like such a simple equation. You eat, you take insulin for what you're about to eat, and then, everything will be fine. You'll be great. And, this real simplifying of this equation that apparently is meant to work and work all the time. There's type 2 diabetes has been branded a lifestyle disease, which just means that people get to blame people for developing type 2 diabetes in the first place. And it completely, doesn't touch on all the other components that are part of a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. I think, people think that you grow out of it. They think that one of the real issues is people think type 1 diabetes is only in kids. And of course, that means that adults with type 1 diabetes, whether they're diagnosed as adults or whether they've had type 1 diabetes since they were kids, they often might not get the care that they need because there are misconceptions about, well, you're an adult, you must have type 2 diabetes. And again, the same with type 2 diabetes. It's seen as only being something in adults. So when younger adults or when teenagers develop it, they're not getting the care that they need, and they're hearing messages that are really reinforcing that stigma and that bias from an early age. So there are a lot. Again, I think it's different for people and what they are hearing and what they're experiencing. But it is harmful. Whatever the stigmatizing messages that we're hearing, however we experience that stigma, it can be very, very harmful.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I spoke about this at the DUK Professionals Conference as one of the voices.
Mhm.
So my experience was the other way round, in that I was told initially it's health anxiety, it's all in your head, there's nothing wrong with you. And then it was, you're type 2, but you're too young to be type 2 because you're only 21. And then in 2019, I was diagnosed type 1. So I've been through that whole like
Yeah. Yep.
it's mind blowing. And the way I was treated when they were saying I was type 2 is completely different to
Yeah.
being type 1. It's crazy.
Yeah. And that's a really horrible thing that we keep hearing. There are a couple of really incredible advocates out of the US who have got stories similar to yours, where they were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and then only because they pushed and pushed and pushed, they were diagnosed with, got a correct diagnosis, because people, they were able to actually get the healthcare that they needed for that diagnosis. And they have said that the care that they get is very different. The way they are treated is very different. And that's so problematic. I mean, it really is. Nobody asks to get any sort of diabetes, and diabetes sucks for everyone. I mean, all diabetes is revolting. So, I think that the idea that, we can treat you a little worse if you've got type 2 diabetes, that comes back to that misconception of, well, you brought it on yourself. I mean, that's just horrid that we have ever gotten to that place, ever.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot more focus on, well, it's because of your diet, you need to change your diet, you're not doing what you should be doing. And yeah. And I
Yeah.
think, like you said before, even amongst other diabetics towards type 2s, it like the way some people are and talk about it,
Yeah.
and like needing this separation, which isn't necessary, is it's not good. It's not good at all.
No, I agree. I mean, I think everybody has a right to know which type of diabetes they have. I think that's really important, because there are different considerations that need to be made with different types of diabetes. So you need to know. And, I will never, ever say that people don't have a right to know to have the right diagnosis, to know what that diagnosis is, and to understand what that means in terms of their overall health, in terms of what it means then for their, their family around them as well. And what does it put people at an increased risk? What does that look like? So everybody has a right to know what type of diabetes they have. Where I really struggle is, I don't, I mean, in the 24 years I've been working in diabetes organizations, I cannot tell you the number of times people have said, or I've seen campaigns to change the name. Let's change the name of type 1 or type 2 or whatever. And the thing that I learnt really early on is that if you don't have to know about diabetes, you do not know about diabetes. You don't know much about it, right? And you can ask me about any other health condition and I will be able to tell you pretty much nothing, because it doesn't impact me, right? We've only got certain amount of bandwidth to think about health stuff, and we are not going to sit there and learn everything we need to know about a health condition that doesn't impact us, doesn't impact our family. So when I talk about, let's address stigma, it isn't about having somebody understand what living with diabetes every minute of every day is like, because I don't expect anyone to know that unless they have to. Exactly the same way as I don't know what it's like to live with Parkinson's disease every minute of every day, because I don't have it. Or pick another chronic condition. What I do want, though, is respect, and I want the bias to go away, and I want the misconceptions to disappear, and I want the discrimination to not be there, and for the attitudes to change and the behaviors towards people with diabetes. They're the things that I want to change. And I think that that's what a lot of the work that we're trying to do is trying to reframe and, what diabetes is, so that, all of those negative things do start to disappear, that we can end diabetes stigma. But, in a previous role, I was the spokesperson for a diabetes organization. And often one of the first things that I would be asked in an interview is, what's the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah.
And I challenge everyone listening to either tell me what you would say right now, or write it down, or think about how it is that you would say that, or go back or go and read interviews where people have done that. Because inevitably, and hopefully this is changing, but what it always had been, or has been, because I still hear it a lot, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. It's when the beta cells in the pancreas no longer produce insulin. Often that's also added, there's also a comment in there that says it's mostly diagnosed in children and teens, which is not true at all, but there is often that in there. There's a misconception, but that's how we define type 1 diabetes. People with type 1 diabetes need to have insulin through a pump or an injection or a pen, syringe, whatever. That's how we define type 1. Then we get to type 2, and 9 times out of 10, you will hear the words, well, type 2 is a lifestyle disease. And people with type 2 diabetes, they produce insulin, their body doesn't use it enough, or can't use it properly, or they don't have enough insulin. And really, if they lose weight and do a bit more exercise, usually they can, that's how they treat their diabetes. Now, firstly, all of that just about is wrong. The bit about not being able to use insulin, or there not being enough insulin, is right. But the rest of it is painting a picture that takes away most of what we really should be talking about. And it was one of the first things when I became a spokesperson for the organization, was that I was really determined to not go with the old tropes that just added to that stigma, and that threw people with type 2 diabetes under the bus every single time somebody put a microphone in front of me. And I just thought we have such a responsibility when we're talking about diabetes to not do that. And you know what? It turned out that it was actually really, really easy to talk about type 2 diabetes in a factual way that didn't punch down. It's not that hard to do it. But sadly, that's not what happens. And so I really encourage people that when they are hearing people use that sort of language to describe type 2 diabetes, that they challenge it and say, okay, well, where are you talking about other risk factors? Where are you talking about the non-modifiable risk factors, the things that we can't do anything about? Age, ethnicity, family history. Can't do anything about that. Previous history of gestational diabetes. Can't do anything about these things. And the other thing that's really interesting, that bit about, what the risk factors are when we talk about what, goes towards developing type 2 diabetes, those modifiable things. So being above what is considered a healthy weight, as if there is one thing. This changes for everyone. Leading a more sedentary lifestyle, these sorts of things. They're the same risk factors for a number of different cancers, for cardiovascular disease. When was the last time you heard somebody who develops a cancer because of the same modifiable risk factors was blamed and told, well, you could have stopped that from happening? Now, we should never do that. Of course, we shouldn't do that. But why is it okay to do it for somebody diagnosed with type 2 diabetes? It can't be okay for type 2 diabetes either. We've got to change the way we talk about it.
Definitely. Which kind of leads on to what I was going to say next, which is, we've talked a little bit about the types of language and that people use and that creating stigma, but it sounds like there's other things as well. It's not just about the language.
Yeah. It's about far more than that. And I think, it's one of the things, and I've written about this, is that, we coined, it was a language position statement, and we started using language matters. And language is very powerful. It is undeniable that the words we use do shape attitudes and behaviors. But it is a lot more than that. And what it also includes things like imagery. It includes the way that you're, so not just the words, but the tone that is used when you're being spoken to. It also includes, messaging is really important as well. So beyond just the words, but also the way that something is said. Is something being told in a way that it's all really doom and gloom with gloomy music in the background and we're thinking it's the end of the world? All of these sorts of things contribute to what we have come to think of diabetes, or the way that diabetes has been thought about. So it is about so much more than just words. And actually, in a lot of ways, it's become really quite problematic when people just fixate on specific words, because there is no one word that if everyone stopped using it today, that it would fix all of the problems that we have with the way that diabetes is communicated about, or it would fix stigma. I despise the term non-compliant. If I never hear that word again when it comes to diabetes, I would be very, very happy. But that's not enough to just say, right, well, we're not going to use that word anymore and everything's going to be better. Until people start thinking about what it is that was the thinking behind that word. What's the behavior, what's the attitude that you have that is making you think a person is non-compliant? Nothing changes. And, it's one of the most hilarious things. I had a researcher once say to me, oh, look, I don't say non-compliant anymore. I now say non-adherent. And it's like, it means the same thing. And your attitude towards what you are saying is that the person with diabetes is being willfully naughty. It means the same thing. You can't just change the word. You've got to change the thinking behind it and the attitude behind it to actually fix the situation. So it is about language, but it's about so much more than language.
Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost like, and the next part is kind of about how healthcare professionals can change and, sort of change their interactions to prevent that stigma from being part of their work as well. Well, I wonder why it is, when something goes wrong, so to speak, is it the person with diabetes' fault? Because like we were saying earlier, it could be they're unwell, it could be the menopause, it could be all of these other things.
Yep.
So how best do you think healthcare professionals can change their thought processes and the way they interact with people with diabetes in that setting?
Yeah. So listening a lot more, not being afraid of silences, asking people with diabetes how they're feeling and how they feel about their encounter with the health professional. How have you felt this has gone, or how has this gone? How have previous appointments gone? What works for you? So understanding that, I think, is really useful. But I also think, checking judgment at the door is really, really important. And that's a really hard, we all judge. Like I'm judging McJudge face a lot of the times. I'm not about diabetes, but about other things, I'm terrible. I see somebody wearing vertical and horizontal stripes at the same time. I'm thinking, what are you thinking? You're hurting my brain. It's very judgy of me. I should just deal with it. People listening to the music that I don't like. It's like, why are you poisoning the air with this music? Very judgy. Let's not be judgy about diabetes. It's not a good place to start. And often that is the starting point. That is where we start. I think recognizing just how hard diabetes is, and one of the conversations that I've had with health professionals that they say has really changed how they've thought things is understanding that living with diabetes, every single day when we choose to live with diabetes, it's an act of advocacy. We are making a choice to live with diabetes as well as we can. Now, some days that means not even thinking about our diabetes, but other days it will mean, packing all your stuff before you go to your MRI, whatever it might look like. So when somebody actually shows up for their clinic appointment, that's pretty amazing. That is an act of advocacy. It's an act of bravery, and it is an act of hope. And that can be all crushed in a second if the first thing that you hear, or even something that you hear at any time during that consultation, is to make somebody feel that they haven't done enough, that they're not doing enough, that they're failing. I always am shocked when I hear somebody, where we say, oh, this person failed on this treatment. It's like, no, they didn't. The treatment failed the person. We've got to use the word fail. The person didn't fail on the treatment. The treatment failed them. It wasn't the right treatment for them. Find something different that's the right one. So it's, really reframing the way that we approach consultations, the way that we see people with diabetes. And I think understanding as well that diabetes is never going to be the most important thing in a person's life. I'm yet to, I'm somebody who works in diabetes, lives with diabetes, writes about diabetes in my spare time and volunteers for diabetes. And I can tell you now, diabetes is not the most important thing in my life. It's really not. So if you're me and you're saying that, somebody who has a job that's got nothing to do with diabetes and is raising a family or not raising a family or running marathons or whatever, diabetes is not going to be the most important thing in their life. So stop expecting it to be.
So is it about more than that sounds like, even with healthcare professionals, it's about more than education?
Yeah, it is. And I saw the same endocrinologist for 20 something years before she rudely retired. And when I went to see her, I was going through when I first started seeing her, I was going through a really difficult time in my life. It was really, really difficult. My mental health was appalling. I desperately wanted to be well enough to think about getting pregnant, and I simply wasn't. But it was all I could think about. And I felt like I was failing because I'd been told that you can't do this. You're not looking after yourself enough. You're kind of failing. And I remember going and seeing her the first time, and she said, she listened a lot. There were a lot of silences that felt awkward, and I'm sure it felt awkward for me. It felt awkward for her, but she didn't try to fill them. And she said to me, we're not here to talk about diabetes for a bit. We've got a lot of other stuff that we need to work through first. And she said, have you ever spoken to a psychiatrist or a psychologist? Have you a counselor, anything? And I said, no. She goes, we're going to start with that. Are you comfortable going and speaking with somebody about more than diabetes, but your diabetes is going to come into it? Maybe. But I think that this is something we need to work on before we can really start to talk about what we need to do to work on your diabetes to get you to a point where you feel comfortable that you're at a point where you're ready to try to have a baby. And I will never, ever forget her kindness and her openness and her willingness to, diabetes is her jam. That's her thing. That's what I was there for. But to say, yeah, you don't need me right now. I will be here and you should still come and see me and that's all fine. But we're not here right now to work out exactly what you need. That's all diabetes focused. That's absolutely not what you need right now. And I think that that's something that I feel like, we all want that holistic care. We all talk about the brilliance of a multidisciplinary team and how, multidisciplinary teams and access to a wide variety of health professionals for what we need is, so important. But so often mental health care is not part of that, right? And so I'm so grateful that was the priority that she set for me. And I didn't realize that that's what I needed because nobody else had said to me, diabetes can impact on your mental health. I hadn't worked that out. I hadn't had diabetes for very long at that point. And that really helped me, really helped me. So I think maybe sometimes we need to think out of the box, be a bit curious about what it is that we're doing and how to get to whatever the goal that we want is. And the goal doesn't need to be getting pregnant. The goal could just be, I just want to get through the day where I feel like diabetes hasn't overwhelmed me.
Yeah.
What is it that we need to get to that? How is it that we do that?
Yeah, definitely. I'm always a massive advocate for more than just, the healthcare professionals being part of diabetes team. I will make a social worker part of that team at some point. That is my goal. I'm gonna be the one.
Back that 100%.
So can you share with everyone some information about the campaigns and things that you've been involved in around diabetes stigma?
Yes. So everybody right now should go to enddiabetesstigma.org. If you have not already signed the pledge to end diabetes stigma, you should do it. It will take you 30 seconds. And then once you've done it, or if you have done it already, you should send that to 5 of your best friends and ask them to sign it. And to your parents and to your siblings and to your next door neighbor and the butcher and anyone else who you think might be interested and really does want to end diabetes stigma. and your organization. Ask if your workplace will sign it as well. And you know what? A pledge is not obviously the be all end all. We know that. But what it does is that there are some really clear things on that pledge, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think there are 6 or 7 specific points, and they are all there to support people with diabetes. It is to end diabetes stigma, but it's also to reframe the way we think about diabetes. It's to say we will do better. I'm going to make an effort to do better. I'm going to call out stigma when I see it. And so, it's something that gets people thinking. And I think that that's really, really important. As I said, there was a consensus statement that was launched, and everybody should have a look at that, share it with your networks. And also, if you go to enddiabetesstigma.org, you will see information about a stigma summit that is coming up later. I think it'll be later this year. And that is sort of being overseen by Jane Spate is the chair of this event, and it is going to involve a lot of people with lived experience of diabetes, who are researchers, who are clinicians, who are working in the diabetes space, government, policymakers, and industry, all stakeholders in diabetes, because this isn't just something that people with diabetes can address ourselves. It's got to be far beyond that. And so that's pretty exciting too. There have been some really incredible diabetes campaigns that have specifically addressed this. Diatribe out of the US has, there it is, that's the global summit. Diatribe out of the US has Destigmatize, which has got some really great resources. The Diabetes Foundation out of India, led by Jaz Sethi, is just doing some really, really important work that's very relevant. Because as I said earlier, stigma does look different in different places, and Jaz is really doing a great job there. And Nupur and Snehal with the Blue Circle Foundation, also in India, are doing some really remarkable work in communities and, but also on global stages as well to address this. And so a lot of it is this grassroots stuff that's going on. And I would really encourage people to have a look at what's being done in the community that is addressing diabetes stigma, and looking just, whether it's a particular part of it, whether it's to do with, getting people to sign the pledge, whether it's to do with, people sharing information about the summit, planning to be at the summit, whether it's, being at a diabetes conference and having a very, very big focus on, raising the issues of stigma, highlighting where people are seeing it. There are all these sorts of things that people are doing, and I would really encourage people to reach out and see what's being done in the community.
Brilliant. So if people were interested, and if you got any kind of suggestions as to where to start in terms of links or things like that you might be able to share?
Yes, I would go to enddiabetesstigma.org as a very good starting point. For language stuff, I would go to, now I'm going to get it wrong, it's either languagemattersdiabetes.org or diabeteslanguagematters.org. But please go there. And the reason I'm going to send you there is because that is where all the language position statements are in one place. And there are over 20 of them now. A lot of them have been translated into different languages. A lot of them are very specific and relevant to certain places around the world. There was a resource that was launched a couple of years ago that Jaz and I worked on around women with diabetes, because there are certainly different considerations that women with diabetes experience, and conversations that I had with us or about us or at us that need to change. So there is, that great resource in there, and there are some really terrific sort of pocket guides that you can give to schools or workplaces or to the media or to sports clubs to address, how people can do better when they're talking about diabetes. So that's a really good place to go to as well. Keep participating in Diabetes Chat, because you guys have been talking about stigma and, really, and mental health and all of these sorts of, I think some people think that these are the nice to have peripheral conversations, but actually I think that these are at the heart of what our lived experience of diabetes is. And you guys have just been doing such a stellar job since you started. I was going to say a couple of years ago, but it's longer than that. It was back in 2020 or something, wasn't it? Or 2021 or something. So it's a number of years now. So thank you for continuing to do that. And talk with, your local communities about what's being done, or conversations that you can have because I think that the grassroots stuff is really what moves and makes change.
Yeah, definitely. We're trying to bring forward in our area in person kind of discussions, so fingers crossed on
Fantastic.
that.
Fantastic.
Is there any advice that you would give to people living with diabetes that are experiencing stigma now?
Yeah. Yeah. So firstly, you're definitely not alone. It is something that is very, very real. Um, and if you're in a situation where you're feeling that, because you've constantly heard that diabetes is your fault, or the situation that you're in with your diabetes is your fault, that is not true. Um, I always encourage people to reach out and look for peer networks. Really, I can't tell you enough how I can't say the number of times that I've heard people say that that is what genuinely changed their trajectory in their diabetes, was when they connected with other people living with the condition.
Mm.
And that can be online, it can be in person, it can be, you don't even need to necessarily participate in conversations. It can just be listening to or reading other people to understand that you're not the only one. I will also say that if you can get involved with things like the pledge and all of those sorts of things, please do, because it there's a sense of ownership then as well that's really, really important. Um, and it's really, really hard to say something and to have to go in to advocate for yourself. It is a good thing to be able to do. So if you find yourself in a situation, in a healthcare appointment, in a workplace meeting, something where somebody says something that upsets you, being able to address that. Please don't think that I'm saying if you're in a meeting with 50 other people and somebody says something that you should right then and there jump up. Unless you're comfortable doing that, you can have a conversation afterwards. But if you can't do that on your own, and it's really, really hard to do it on your own, find somebody who can support you through it. So if it's in the workplace, if you're part of a union, you should be part of a union, talk with your union delegate or representative, and get their support and understand, how they can support you with those conversations. If you're at school, if there's a school counselor, fantastic. If you need your parents, get your parents on board. If you need your best mate to do it, get your best mate to do it. And in healthcare settings, it can be really hard because there is a power hierarchy. No matter how much we like to think that we're on one level, we're not. If you need to take somebody with you and you have somebody that you can take with you, do that. Remember that hospitals do have advocates often if there's somebody that you can talk to. And I know, I feel like, I used to be really flippant when I used to say, well, change doctors if you don't like the one that you've got. That's not easy. It's become harder and harder to do that. But if it is possible for you to do that, have a look at what else is out there. And one way to find the good ones is to talk with people with diabetes in your local area, because we all talk about the good ones. We all talk about the great ones, because we want to sing their praises. And remember, and again, I will say this, if you have had a terrible experience, I'm so sorry, but that isn't the norm. The vast majority of health professionals out there really are not going to be making you feel that way.
Yeah, definitely. I found my current consultant through someone saying you should go there.
Yeah, absolutely. I know.
Absolutely.
And hey, if you can, by some miracle, find one who also happens to have diabetes. Oh my goodness, that can be life-changing for people. And I say that as somebody who, my diabetes educator, who I adore and I've been seeing for a very long time, she's got type 1 herself. She has type 1. She's got kids with type 1. And it is just so wonderful to have a health professional who says, look, here's what I have to tell you, but here's the reality of it as well, so that that this is what I learned, and this is what I say to health professionals who, I think sometimes it's especially diabetes educators, they think that because we've become so empowered and we talk to each other, we're trying to do them out of a job, which is so not true, because we need our diabetes educators, all of our healthcare professionals, to teach us the rules. But more importantly, when we learn those rules, we then learn how to break them safely, right? And that is really powerful, being able to do diabetes our own way. But to do that, you don't want to have to muddle your way through without having a good foundation first. And that good foundation comes from, having a health professional who you feel that you can really trust and work with. So if that means you've got to find one with type 1 or type 2 diabetes or whatever type of diabetes you've got, good luck. See if that works too. There are lots of things that, lots of little avenues that you can take until you find the right one for you.
Yeah, it did make all the difference, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying, but the lead DSN in our trust for the pump service is type 1. Like, who better to speak to about it? Like, it's great. I love it when she's at appointments.
Nothing about us without us. It absolutely is really, it means a lot. Yeah.
Okay. So the last question is about how can the diabetes community, further advocate amongst ourselves in reducing stigma and creating greater understanding?
Yeah. Well, this is a really good example of it. If there's any platform at all, put stigma on the agenda. I think that's a really important way to start to address it. I mean, we are often then talking amongst ourselves, and we can think, oh, well, it's just preaching to the converted already. But it's not just that, because it might mean that people who have been experiencing stigma but didn't really have any ideas about what to do about it are learning some new ideas or understanding who they can have a chat with about it to learn more. I would also say that if you can get involved in any sort of grassroots initiative, go and do it. Become part of it. If you're a DDoc voice, that network is just so powerful. And if you're not a DDoc voice, you should learn about DDoc, which is a community run out of Europe, but open to people around the world. There are over 400 DDoc voice alumni who have attended conferences around the world, who call out stigma when they hear it at those conferences, stand up and speak about stigma at the conferences, and other issues that are really, really important to people with diabetes. So I would just really encourage people to form those networks. They're really powerful. They really, really can drive some very, very significant change. And, I know that in the UK, you're so fortunate with, really some really important grassroots initiatives. You've got great diabetes organizations who work so closely with community, which is really important. And, I just think that taking advantage of those sorts of things where you can to be part of it is just such a brilliant thing that you can do.
Yeah, definitely. I think we were talking about at DUK, someone had raised before that it tends to be type 1s who are coming along and being the voices, and they're not amazing. We've got all different types of diabetes at the next conference, and that was just like, yeah, this is great. This is amazing.
Absolutely. And, I know that with DDoc, with the voices, there's been a real push to make sure that we're hearing from people, a lot more people with type 2 diabetes. And that includes putting people with type 2 on the program around during the DDoc symposium and symposia at each of the different conferences, and hearing from people with type 2 as well. The diabetes advocacy community has been overwhelmingly type 1, overwhelmingly white and privileged. It absolutely has. And there certainly has been a shift towards really trying to hear from more diverse voices and more experiences from different countries. And there was nothing good that came out of COVID ever. But one thing that did happen was that with everything going online, it suddenly meant that the online conversations that had been happening quite regionally and, in our own communities really opened up. And for the first time, we were hearing incredible advocacy voices from different African countries. We were really hearing about what was going on in India. We were hearing about what was going on in Pakistan. And, whereas beforehand, unless you happened to find yourself at an IDF Congress, you may not have heard that. But we've still got a long way to go to make sure that we have got a balance with, so that we're hearing from more people who don't sound like me, quite frankly. And that, and so I'm going to quote my dear friend, diabetes advocate, DDoc voice, Chelsea Rice, who says, if there is no seat at the table for you, pull up a chair. And he's right. And I have had that in the back of my mind for a very long time, because that's what he said. And I will also say, bring another chair and sit someone else next to you, someone who probably hasn't had a chance to be there before, if you can do that.
Definitely. I think, well, someone did that for me, so now if I can also do that for someone else, then brilliant.
I'm so glad they did that for you, Kez. I'm so glad.
Yeah, I wouldn't have known where to start, but yeah, it made all the difference.
But our whole community is better for it. You know,
Yeah.
having you as part of this, our whole community is better, you know, the Diabetes Chat community is better for it. So I'm very grateful that somebody did that. And also the DDoc community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So have you got a final message that you wanted to share with everyone before we finish for today?
I will say that nobody should have to deal with diabetes stigma, and there are a lot of things that are happening to try and address that. But if you do feel that you are being stigmatized, please do seek help if you can. And I will also say that internalized stigma, those horrible things that we say to ourselves, that if we heard our best mate saying that to themselves, like if we heard another friend with diabetes saying that about themselves, we would be horrified. I think we all need to do a little bit of work there and try and not self-sabotage and be so hard on ourselves, because living with diabetes is really hard. It's an act of advocacy. You're doing that every single day. It's so remarkable and so amazing. Someone needs to pat you on the back, and you know, it's probably gonna have to be you. You're gonna probably have to do it yourself. But that's okay. You can do that.
We certainly can. Certainly can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about diabetes stigma. It's been amazing having you here, and just like you said, getting it out there again. So thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. And you know, I do listen into Diabetes Chat when I can. Daylight saving, well, you guys have it at the moment. We don't, because we're coming into winter. This time of year is no good for us with Diabetes Chat. It is on too early. But, you know, I do try to play a bit of catch up afterwards. And please keep doing what you're doing. This is such an important part of our global diabetes community. So thank you very, very much for what you're doing.
Oh, we appreciate that. Thank you.
All good.